Welcome back to our Grade Center Basics video series. This is part 3. This video will cover weighted grades. We'll talk about grade categories, the two different types of weighted grade calculations, setting up a weighted total column, and how extra credit works with weighted grades. Before we get started, I'd like to let you know that this will be one of the longest videos in the series, and it's one of the most complicated topics that we'll cover in this series, so if you need to, I would definitely encourage you to re-watch it and go back over the parts of it that as you're working to set up weighted grades in your own course. So before we get into Grade Center in Blackboard, I wanted to cover some important facts about weighted grades in Blackboard, and then we'll go into Blackboard and into Grade Center and we'll see what it looks like. First, let's talk about categories. Almost every issue we encounter with weighted grades in Blackboard is a result of an issue with categories. So when you're using weighted grades, be sure you've taken these 3 important steps. Create all categories you plan to use. So reference your syllabus and see what categories you have defined in your syllabus, and then make sure you have matching categories in Blackboard. And Blackboard does have some defaults, which we'll have a look at in a little bit. You want to also make sure that you include all of your categories at the proper percentages in your total calculation. So we'll go through that step by step. The third and most often missed step is to assign all grade items to the appropriate category. The second issue we encounter with weighted grades is typically noticed by faculty who have used Pinnacle in the past. A lot of seated faculty use Pinnacle. There are 2 different types of weighted grade calculations. Both are acceptable and both are mathematically sound. Neither one is right or wrong. However, they do produce slightly different results. The methods are equal and proportional, and Blackboard's default is equally while Pinnacle's is proportional. So that's why we see a difference in the calculations in the 2 systems for weighted grades, and that's why a lot of faculty who are accustomed to using Pinnacle assume that Blackboard is miscalculating. It's not miscalculating, they're just calculating differently, and each system is capable of performing the other calculation function. It's just their defaults are opposite. So the difference between the 2 is how the items are calculated within the category. For equally calculated items, all of the items in the category, regardless of their point value, are worth the same portion of the category's overall total. While for proportionally weighted grades, items are worth a proportion of the overall categories value based on their own point value. So now that we've talked about some of the issues that we often encounter with weighted grades, let's have a look in Blackboard and set up some weighted grades. We'll start by navigating to the Full Grade Center in our control panel, Grade Center, Full Grade Center. Now remember, our first step is to set up some categories, and to do that, in the Manage button, we'll select Categories. Again, there are some default categories within Blackboard, and you can use these categories or you can create your own. Blackboard items like assignments or discussions will default to those categories, and you can see on this screen what items are in those different categories, and you'll see as you create your own categories and assign different grade items to them, you'll see them listed here as well. You can change which category any item is in at any time, so these are not set in stone. So for creating your columns to start setting up your weighted grades, unless the categories that you have in your syllabus match the categories in Blackboard exactly, I highly recommend creating your own categories. That way the categories that are in Grade Center and in your syllabus match exactly, and it helps eliminate some of the confusion for students and for faculty, and definitely for staff members who have to get in and kind of troubleshoot if something goes wrong. So let's make a category. We're going to click the Create Category button, and we'll give this category a name. I'm going to call it Lab Work, and we can provide a description, but we don't have to. And then we'll click Submit, and now we can see our category is in the list of categories. available for use in the course, and we can edit or delete the categories that we create ourselves as needed. Once we've created all the categories we need to match our syllabus, we'll click OK and return to the Full Grade Center to set up our weighted total. By default, a weighted total does exist in the Grade Center. However, there's no calculation set up on it, so it won't ever display a score, even as you enter scores for students in the course. And in Part 2, we set our weighted total as our external grade total. So we want to go ahead and delete the standard total column so that we don't cause confusion for students. They're not seeing two different grades as their total. Okay, now we're ready to set up our calculation. So from the column header, we'll select Edit Column Information. You'll notice that the column is already set up to display percentage, and that's helpful to students since a point total wouldn't really express their overall grade clearly. If we scroll down to section 3, this is where we'll set up the calculations for the weighted total. So from this lower box, we'll select our categories and we'll click this lower arrow to move those categories into our calculations box. Now we'll add the percentage for each category. Again, be sure your percentages match what's in your syllabus. You'll notice that the total weight equals 100, and you won't be able to click the final submit until that does equal 100. So you can't accidentally value the column at less than 100. Here are those column weight calculations that we talked about earlier, the equal or proportional. You also have the option to drop any number of highest or lowest grades in each category, or use the highest or lowest value within that category to calculate that category's overall grade. Once you have all of your options set for each category, the remaining options are the same as those for the standard total, and we're going to leave those at default, and we'll go ahead and click Submit. Now our weighted total will calculate the weighted grade for students accurately according to the way we have set it up. We're going to take some time now to talk about extra credit. Extra credit with weighted grades in Blackboard can get kind of complicated. First, I want to mention that extra credit on individual assignments is simple. You just add the extra points to that column, to that score, and that's perfectly fine. That doesn't require any extra adjustment on your part. But if you want to create an independent column specifically for extra credit, that can get a little tricky. So let's take a moment to break that down. If we're using a separate extra credit column, we'll first start by creating total columns, standard total columns for each category. We'll look at this in just a minute. Then we'll use a total column again and use the calculations instead of the all columns. We'll use the subtotal columns for each category. This function will not work properly if you use the drop lowest grade, because the extra credit will always be seen as the lowest grade. It's also important to remember that you have to add that extra credit column to a category. So you have to assign it to one of your categories. So let's look at how we would set up weighted grades with an independent extra credit column. We're going to create a calculated total column, standard total column, for each of our categories. We'll start with assignments. We'll change our section 3 settings from all grade columns to selected grade columns and categories, and we'll move the appropriate category into the box. Remember, we can't use the drop highest and lowest grades anymore because that will interfere with the calculations. So everything else we'll leave as default, and we'll click Submit. We'll do that for each of our different categories that our overall weighted grade will be based on. Okay, so here we have those total columns which only include the categories for each of our categories. We had assignments, lab work, discussions, and tests. Now we go back to our weighted total, and we have to make some adjustment to the way that's set up. So we'll select edit column information from the column header. And instead of basing our calculation on these categories, we'll go ahead and remove those by clicking the red X. And instead of using our categories function, we'll select those total columns that included only the categories that we had just created. So that's assignments, lab work, discussions, and tests. And we'll move those over. Again, we'll set the percentages as we had before. And we'll click submit. Now your weighted total column will properly calculate the weighted total, including the extra credit. Alright, now you know how to set up categories, weighted totals, you know the difference between the different types of weighted calculations, and how extra credit interacts with weighted grades. If your head is spinning, don't feel bad. Weighted grades can be really complicated. If you watch this video several times and you're still having trouble, feel free to reach out to us. We can help you get things set up. Weighted grades can be tricky, but you can do it, and we're here to help. And as always, be awesome.